Welcome to Triple C Stories. Get ready for thrilling African folktales filled with wisdom, adventure, and unforgettable lessons. Don't just watch, like, share, and subscribe to keep these stories alive.
Juliet Parker had always believed in control. It was the foundation upon which she built her life, her career, and her company. At 30, she was one of the youngest CEOs in the tech industry, a woman who had clawed her way to the top with relentless ambition and an unyielding work ethic. Her mornings were structured to perfection: an early workout, a black coffee, a brief scan of the news, and then straight into the polished world of Nexatech, where she commanded a team of some of the most brilliant minds in cybersecurity. The day had started no differently. She had walked into her office at exactly 8:45 a.m., her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floors, her assistant trailing behind with the day's agenda. Meetings, investor calls, a product review. Nothing out of the ordinary. Her company was thriving, her life was in order, and the world was right where she needed it to be. That illusion shattered the moment Paul, her lead cybersecurity expert, burst into her office, his face drained of all color. His arrival was abrupt, uncharacteristic of his usual calm demeanor, and for a brief second, Juliet felt something she rarely did: unease. Paul had always been measured, precise in his communication, but now he looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. She barely had time to acknowledge the shift before he spoke, his voice low and tight. "Juliet, we have a problem. A serious one." Juliet straightened in her chair, setting down her coffee without taking a sip. Problems were a part of the job. She had built an empire on solving them, navigating crises with the precision of a surgeon. "Talk to me," she said, her voice steady despite the slight knot forming in her stomach. Paul hesitated for half a second, then moved forward, placing a tablet on her desk and turning it towards her. The numbers on the screen didn't make sense at first: rows and columns of financial data, transaction logs, security clearances. Then, as if someone had turned a dial and sharpened the focus, she saw it. $50 million. Gone. A sum so large that for a moment, her mind refused to process it. Her breath hitched, but outwardly, she remained composed. "When?" she asked, her voice clipped. "Sometime between midnight and 3 a.m., Paul replied. "We've been running diagnostics all morning." The breach was sophisticated. His hesitation was new, unsettling. Paul was one of the best in the field, a man who had seen every kind of cyber attack imaginable. If he was struggling to explain it, they were in trouble. Juliet picked up the tablet, scrolling through the data with quick, precise movements. "Is there a trace?" she asked. Paul shook his head. "Nothing." It was clean. Too clean. That, more than anything, sent a chill through her. Every hack left a trail, however faint, however buried. There was always something to find. If this one had been executed without a single footprint, they weren't dealing with just any hacker. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had planned meticulously, someone who had outmaneuvered her entire security team without breaking a sweat. Juliet placed the tablet back on her desk and leaned back in her chair, her mind already spinning with possibilities. The company's security systems were among the best. Layered firewalls, real-time encryption, an internal threat detection system that had been tested against some of the most advanced cyber threats. For someone to bypass all of that and disappear without a trace meant one of two things. Either they had someone on the inside, or they were dealing with a level of expertise she hadn't encountered before. The thought unsettled her. "How long before the investors catch wind of this?" she asked. Paul hesitated. "A few days. Maybe less. It depends on how quickly the financial department notices discrepancies. Right now, it's buried under routine transfers and account movements, but it won't stay that way for long." Juliet exhaled slowly, weighing her options. Panic wouldn't solve this. If word got out before they had a solution, Nexitech would be in freefall. Investors would pull out, the board would demand answers she couldn't give, and the media would have a field day with headlines about a billion-dollar company being robbed blind. She had built her reputation on being untouchable, and now that image was hanging by a thread. "Shut down external access to the financial servers," she ordered. "I don't want a single transaction processed without my approval. Start tracing all recent logins, failed attempts, anything that even looks remotely out of place. And for now, we keep this between us. No one outside this office knows." Paul nodded, though the tension in his shoulders remained. Understood. He turned to leave, but hesitated at the door. "Juliet, whoever did this, they knew exactly where to hit us. This wasn't random. It was calculated." She met his gaze, something cold settling in her chest. "I know," she said. The rest of the day passed in a haze of back-to-back meetings with her core team. Engineers, analysts, financial experts, all scrambling to make sense of what had happened. Juliet remained at the center of it all, directing, delegating, strategizing. But as hours passed with no answers, frustration mounted. The more they searched, the more apparent it became that the hacker had left nothing behind. Every lead ended in a dead end, every attempted trace came back empty. By evening, the air in the office was thick with exhaustion and tension. Juliet remained behind after everyone else had left, sitting alone in her office, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The adrenaline from the morning had faded, leaving behind something heavier. Failure wasn't an option, but for the first time in years, she felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. "Paul." She answered on the first ring. "Tell me you have something." There was a pause on the other end. "Nothing yet," he admitted. "But I might have a lead. It's not conventional, but it might be our best shot." Juliet closed her eyes briefly before reopening them. "I'm listening." Paul hesitated, then finally said, "There's someone I know. An expert in cases like this. He's not corporate, not exactly by the book, but he's the best at what he does." She frowned slightly. "Who is he?" "His name is Jay Cotter." Juliet had never heard the name before, but something in Paul's tone made her pause. "And you trust him?" Paul exhaled. "I do. But he's different." She didn't like vague descriptions. "Different how?" "He doesn't do suits and boardrooms. He doesn't work with corporations. But if anyone can find who did this, it's him." Juliet stared at her reflection in the glass, weighing the risk. Bringing in an outsider was dangerous. But time was running out, and they were out of options. "Get him here," she said finally. "On it," Paul replied before the line went dead. Juliet remained seated, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. Whoever had done this had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated her. And she would make sure they regretted it. The air inside Nexitech's headquarters had changed. It no longer carried the quiet hum of efficiency Juliet had cultivated over the years. Now, there was a heaviness, a collective anxiety that settled over the entire office like a thick fog. Employees spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the executive wing where Juliet and her core team had barricaded themselves since the breach. The tension was suffocating, pressing against every conversation, every keystroke, every hurried footstep down the corridors. The weight of $50 million vanished into thin air was too great to ignore. Juliet sat at the head of the long conference table, her gaze scanning the weary faces of her best analysts and engineers. They had been at it for hours, tracking leads that went nowhere, running simulations that came up empty. The walls were lined with digital screens displaying code, financial logs, and security feeds, Yet none of it provided the answers they needed. The frustration in the room was palpable, a ticking bomb waiting to explode. But Juliet refused to let it. She couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. Not when everything she had built was at stake. "We're missing something," she said finally, her voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "Hackers don't erase $50 million without leaving a trace. There has to be something, anything, we can use." Paul rubbed a hand over his tired face. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his shirt slightly wrinkled, his usual composure faltering. "We've combed through every possible entry point, Juliet. There's nothing. No unusual access logs, no forced breaches, no suspicious activity before the attack. It's like they walked in and out without opening a single door." That wasn't possible. It shouldn't have been possible. Nexiteka's security systems were designed to detect even the faintest attempt at unauthorized access. The idea that someone could infiltrate their network, take what they wanted, and disappear without a digital footprint was beyond comprehension. And yet, here they were. Juliet leaned forward, her fingers pressing against the cool surface of the table as she thought. "Then we're looking in the wrong place," she murmured. All eyes turned to her. She could feel their desperation, their exhaustion, but she ignored it. They had to think differently. If traditional traces weren't leading them anywhere, they needed to approach this from another angle. What if it wasn't just a digital attack? She asked, her mind working faster than her words. What if someone had inside access? What if they didn't hack in from the outside but were already here? A murmur of unease rippled through the room. The idea of an internal breach was worse than an external one. It meant that someone within Nexitek had betrayed them, had orchestrated the entire thing from inside their own walls. Paul frowned, arms crossed tightly over his chest. "We considered that possibility," he said. "But we ran employee access logs. Nothing suspicious. No unauthorized logins, no unusual behavior leading up to the attack." What if they didn't need to log in? Juliet countered. The room fell silent again. What if they planted something before they left? A backdoor, a dormant virus, something that activated on a timer. It wasn't unheard of. Some of the most devastating cyberattacks in history had been orchestrated this way, through someone on the inside planting a weakness before walking away clean. Juliet turned to one of her engineers, a sharp-minded woman named Dana who had been with Nexitek since its early days. "Can we scan for dormant malware? Something that might have been installed days, maybe even weeks ago." Dana's fingers were already flying over her keyboard. "It'll take time, but yes. If there's something hidden in the system, we'll find it." It was a small flicker of hope, but Juliet held on to it. They had to keep digging. They had to find something. Because the alternative, accepting that the money was gone forever, wasn't an option. Hours passed, the tension in the room thickening with every failed attempt to uncover the truth. Employees came and went, delivering updates that all sounded the same. No traces, no leads, nothing. The weight of failure pressed heavier against Juliet's shoulders, but she refused to give in to it. She couldn't. She wouldn't. This company was everything to her. She had poured her blood, sweat, and soul into building it from the ground up. She had fought to be taken seriously in an industry dominated by men, had sacrificed relationships, friendships, even sleep, to turn Nexitek into what it was today. Losing $50 million wasn't just a financial disaster. It was personal. She wasn't just fighting to save a company. She was fighting to save herself. Paul sat beside her, his brows furrowed in deep thought. "We're running out of time," he said quietly. "The investors are going to start asking questions soon." "I know," Juliet replied, her jaw tightening. She knew exactly how much time they had before the whispers started turning into full-blown panic. A few days at most before someone noticed the missing funds and started digging. And once that happened, there would be no controlling the narrative. "We need help," Paul said suddenly. Juliet turned to him. "What kind of help?" He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. An outsider. Someone who doesn't work within corporate structures. Someone who thinks differently. Juliet arched a brow. You have someone in mind? Paul nodded slowly. Jay Carter. He's a freelancer. A hacker, technically. But he works on the right side of the law. Most of the time. Juliet frowned. The idea of bringing in an outsider, especially one with a history of working outside legal boundaries, was risky. Too risky. Nexitech had built its reputation on integrity, on following the rules. But rules hadn't saved them from this breach. And if she was being honest, she was running out of choices. Juliet leaned back in her chair, considering her options. Jay Carter. She had never heard the name before, but the way Paul spoke about him made it clear. He wasn't just another IT consultant. He was something else. Why haven't I heard of him? She asked. Paul gave a small, almost amused smirk. Because he doesn't do corporate work. He doesn't take on cases like this. He prefers staying in the shadows. Then why would he take this one? Because if anyone can track down the ghost who did this, it's him. Juliet exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping against the table. It went against every instinct she had. She didn't like working with people she didn't know, people she couldn't control. But she had always prided herself on being pragmatic, and right now, the pragmatic choice was clear. Bring him in, she said finally. Paul nodded, already pulling out his phone. As he stepped away to make the call, Juliet stared at the screens in front of her, the same useless data staring back at her. She wasn't used to feeling powerless. She didn't like it. Whoever had done this thought they had won. They thought they had beaten her. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Juliet's office felt colder than usual that morning, though the air conditioning was no different from any other day. The tension that had been steadily rising over the past week now seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence. Every breath felt heavier, every movement more calculated. She sat behind her desk, staring at the phone that lay face up on the polished surface. Paul had sent a message half an hour ago. He's here. Juliet had expected relief at those words, but instead, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Her gaze shifted to the large window behind her desk, the morning sun gleaming over the city skyline. The view usually brought her a sense of calm, but not today. Today, she felt like she was standing on the edge of a crumbling ledge, one wrong move away from disaster. $50 million gone. Her company's future hung in the balance, and the man she was about to meet, this so-called expert, was her last hope. She wasn't used to relying on people she didn't know, especially not men like Jay Carter. Paul had tried to assure her that Jay was brilliant, unconventional, but effective. Juliet had done her research after Paul mentioned his name, what little she could find, anyway. Jay Carter didn't leave much of a trail. No LinkedIn profile, no official website, nothing to suggest he even existed in professional circles. His name popped up in obscure forums and tech blogs, sometimes linked to complex security fixes that no one could explain. The anonymity unsettled her. She hated the idea of working with someone so elusive, but she hated feeling powerless even more. The knock on her door was firm, confident. Juliet sat straighter in her chair, her fingers curling tightly around the armrest. "Come in," she called. Paul entered first, followed by a man who seemed completely out of place in Nexitech's sharp, polished environment. Jay Carter walked in without hesitation, his eyes scanning the room like he was assessing her before she could assess him. He was younger than she expected, likely in his late 20s, with sharp features and the kind of casual confidence that didn't need to be forced. He wore dark jeans and a fitted black shirt, no suit, no tie, just the bare minimum of professionalism. His hair was tousled like he hadn't cared enough to fix it, and yet nothing about him seemed careless. His gaze lingered on her for just a second longer than necessary, and Juliet felt a flicker of annoyance. She didn't like being studied. "Miss Parker," Jay greeted her with a slight nod. His voice was low, calm, completely unbothered by the gravity of the situation. Juliet extended her hand, maintaining her professional smile. His handshake was firm but brief. "Thank you for coming," she said coolly. "I assume Paul has filled you in on the details?" Jay's lips twitched, almost a smirk. "I read the reports," he replied. "It's a clean hit. Whoever did this knew your system better than your own team." Juliet's expression hardened. "I don't need a lecture on what went wrong," she said. "I need you to fix it." Jay shrugged. "I wouldn't be here if I couldn't." His confidence was infuriating. Paul, sensing the tension, quickly spoke up. "Juliet, Jay has a theory," he said. "He thinks the hacker's still watching us." Juliet's eyes narrowed. "Watching us? If they're smart enough to pull this off, they'll want to know if you're onto them," Jay explained. "They'll expect you to panic, lock down your servers, tighten security. That's when they'll strike again. They'll be looking for vulnerabilities in your reaction." Juliet's fingers tapped against her desk. "So what do you suggest?" "We make them think they found one," Jay said simply. "We bait them." Juliet blinked. "You want to lure them back in?" "It's the only way," Jay said with a shrug. "They're too smart to come back unless they think you've left a door open. We need to convince them they have a clear path, and when they take the bait, we'll catch them." Juliet glanced at Paul, unsure. "It's risky," Paul said quietly, "but I think it's our best shot." Juliet exhaled slowly. Every instinct told her to resist, to hold on to the strict control she had built her company around. But this situation was unlike anything she had faced before. Reluctantly, she gave a small nod. "Do it." The following 2 days felt like walking a tightrope. Jay worked fast, moving through Nexateca's system like he had built it himself. He seemed to know exactly where the hacker would probe, constructing a carefully crafted vulnerability within their servers. Juliet spent most of her time hovering nearby, observing him. Jay worked quietly, his focus unshakable, fingers flying over the keyboard with an effortless precision that reminded her why Paul trusted him. There was something unsettling about him, though. He wasn't just confident. He was comfortable in chaos, like he thrived in uncertainty. It bothered her because she couldn't tell if it came from experience or arrogance. They hardly spoke, yet Juliet caught him watching her more than once. Not with curiosity or interest, more like he was sizing her up, constantly assessing. Late one evening, she found him still at his station, eyes locked on the screen. "You never stop, do you?" she said, breaking the silence. Jay didn't look away from the code. "Neither do you," he replied. "You've been hovering since I got here." "I like to know what's happening in my company," she shot back. He chuckled under his breath. "You don't trust me." "I don't know you," Juliet corrected. Jay finally turned to face her, his green eyes sharp and unwavering. "I'm not the one who stole $50 million, he said quietly. "But I'll be the one who gets it back." His words lingered, unsettling her more than she wanted to admit. On the third day, Jay called her into the war room. The entire room was buzzing with quiet energy. Employees gathered around the screens. "What is it?" Juliet asked as she stepped inside. Jay didn't look away from the screen. "They're back," he said. Juliet's pulse quickened as she moved closer. Lines of code scrolled rapidly down the screen, a digital footprint forming in real time. "They took the bait," Jay muttered, almost to himself. "They're trying to reroute another transfer, but this time they're sloppy. Greedy." Juliet watched as Jay's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Can you track them?" she asked. "I'm already doing it," he replied. "They think they're still invisible." Minutes felt like hours as Jay chased the hacker through layers of encryption. His focus was relentless, his eyes locked on the screen, his breathing shallow. "Gotcha," he whispered suddenly. A set of coordinates flashed across the screen. "They're in Lagos," Jay said, leaning back with a satisfied smirk. "I've locked their location. They won't get far." Relief flooded Juliet so fast it left her lightheaded. "You did it," she said, almost in disbelief. Jay turned to her, his expression softening. "We did it," he corrected. For the first time since the breach, Juliet allowed herself to breathe. The nightmare was over, or at least, it was ending. Yet as her team celebrated quietly around her, Juliet found her gaze lingering on Jay. There was something about him, something unsettling but strangely reassuring. He had walked into her world without hesitation, unraveled her company's most complex crisis like it was nothing, and now he stood there, calm and content as if he hadn't just saved her company from financial ruin. "I owe you," she said quietly. Jay's smile was faint. "You'll figure out a way to repay me," he said, his voice almost teasing. Juliet wasn't so sure. Something told her Jay Carter wasn't the kind of man who played by anyone's rules but his own. Juliet sat at her desk, her fingers lightly tapping the polished surface as she stared at her phone. The screen was dark, but her mind was anything but calm. The call she'd received earlier lingered in her thoughts like an unwelcome guest. Philip's voice had stirred something inside her, something uncomfortable, something she thought she had buried months ago. It wasn't just his words that unsettled her. It was how easily he had slipped back into her life, like a shadow creeping in beneath a locked door. She hated that she had let the call linger for more than a minute, hated that she had allowed him to speak long enough to say he was sorry. Apologies meant nothing to her anymore. Apologies had come too late. Yet somehow, instead of cutting him off, she had listened. Not because she wanted to forgive him, but because a part of her, some stubborn, fragile part, wondered if maybe he had changed. Maybe there was still a shred of the man she had once trusted, once believed in. The memory of that night refused to fade. She could still see the image so clearly, the dim lighting in Philip's apartment, the faint scent of wine in the air, and then the sharp, gut-wrenching moment when she walked in and saw him. His shirt half unbuttoned, his tie slung over the back of a chair, and his secretary, Melissa, curled too comfortably against him, her fingers still tangled in his hair. The cold rush of disbelief had hit her first, numbing her before the rage arrived. Even now, the anger simmered beneath her skin like an open wound that refused to close. And yet, here she was, still wondering why she hadn't just ended the conversation the moment she heard his voice. Juliet had always believed in second chances. She had seen her parents struggle to rebuild their relationship after her father's infidelity years ago. Her mother had forgiven, her father had changed, and somehow their family had grown stronger. Juliet had believed in that kind of change once, believed that mistakes could be repaired, that love was enough to overcome betrayal. But Philip's betrayal hadn't just been a mistake, it had been calculated, cold. The memory twisted in her mind like a knife. She had trusted him, allowed him into her world, believed that he was someone she could build a life with. And he had thrown it all away as if it meant nothing. 4 weeks after that night, Philip had called and texted relentlessly. He had sent flowers, written long messages apologizing, begging her to talk to him. Each attempt had gone unanswered, each voicemail deleted without a second thought. But tonight she had answered. Juliet couldn't explain why. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was that small, stubborn part of her that needed to know if she had been wrong. If somehow, by some miracle, Philip was capable of change. His voice had been quieter than she remembered, softer. The arrogance that had always shadowed his words seemed absent. He sounded tired, almost defeated. "I know I don't deserve to ask," he had said, "but I need you to give me a chance to make things right." She had scoffed at that. "You had your chance," she had shot back, "and you made your choice." But Philip had pressed on, his voice low and insistent. "Please," he had pleaded. Just give me a few minutes. Let me explain." She should have refused him outright, ended the call and deleted his number for good. Instead, she had heard herself say the words that now haunted her. "Fine," she had said. "One chance." The cafe Philip had chosen was quiet, tucked away in a corner of the city she rarely visited. Juliet arrived 10 minutes early, partly because she didn't trust Philip to keep his word, but mostly because she wanted to feel like she had control over the situation. The air inside smelled of roasted coffee beans and warm pastries, and despite the tension twisting in her stomach, she ordered a drink and settled into a booth near the window. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup as she stared outside, watching people hurry past on the rain-slick pavement. She wondered what Jay would think if he knew she was here. She hadn't spoken to him since the Nexatech breach had been resolved, but his presence still lingered in her mind. Jay had been sharp, intense, a force of nature that seemed impossible to forget. He had walked into her office with quiet confidence, solved a crisis that had threatened to destroy her company, and then disappeared without a word. Juliet wasn't sure why she thought of him now, except that Jay felt like the opposite of Philip. Where Philip had been charming and persuasive, Jay had been steady and certain. He hadn't tried to win her over with words. He had simply proven himself through action. And yet here she was, waiting for Philip, the man who had betrayed her, to explain why he deserved another chance. The thought made her stomach twist. Philip arrived exactly on time, stepping into the cafe like he belonged there. He looked better than she remembered. Sharper, more composed. His hair was neater, his shirt crisp beneath his tailored blazer. He smiled when he saw her, and for a brief second, Juliet felt that old familiarity stir inside her. It vanished the moment he sat down. "I'm glad you came," Philip said, his voice softer than usual. Juliet didn't respond. She just stared at him, waiting. The silence stretched between them until Philip finally exhaled. "I know I messed up," he began. "I know I hurt you. And I know I have no right to ask for another chance." His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his coffee cup. "But I couldn't leave things the way they were." Juliet's gaze hardened. "You didn't seem too concerned about that when you were with Melissa." His face faltered, the mask of confidence slipping. "I was stupid," he said quickly. "I was selfish, and I thought I could get away with it. But I never stopped caring about you. I never stopped." His voice trailed off, and for a moment, Juliet saw something in his eyes. Regret, maybe even shame. But she didn't know if she could believe it. Juliet's mind drifted as Philip spoke. His words felt rehearsed, calculated, yet part of her wanted to believe he was sincere. She hated herself for it. After everything he had done, after all the hurt he had caused, there was still a small part of her that remembered how things had been before. The quiet dinners, the late-night conversations, the way his arm had once felt solid and safe around her shoulders. Those memories had been real, hadn't they? Or had they always been part of the lie? "I just want a chance," Philip said quietly, "to show you I've changed." Juliet felt her chest tighten, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't answer. Could people change? Could Philip? The safe answer was no, that people who broke your trust once would only break it again. But what if she was wrong? What if giving him one more chance was the right thing to do? The conflict churned inside her, twisting her thoughts into knots. "I don't know," she said finally. "I don't know if I can believe you." Philip nodded, as though he had expected that answer. "I get it," he said. "But let me prove it to you." He leaned closer, his voice softer. "You don't have to decide now. Just give me time." Juliet swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "One chance," she said. "That's all." Juliet sat in her car outside Philip's apartment for what felt like an eternity. Her fingers drummed restlessly against the steering wheel, her thoughts tangled in a chaotic mess of anger, disbelief, and frustration. The video Lucy had shown her played on a loop in her mind. She had tried to convince herself that maybe there was an explanation, some excuse or misunderstanding that would justify Philip's behavior. But deep down, she knew better. Philip had always been smooth, charming and confident, but that confidence often masked his tendency to manipulate situations to his advantage. Juliet knew now that his charm had been nothing more than a polished veneer, one she had been foolish enough to believe in. As she stared at the building, memories came flooding back. The evenings spent curled up on his couch, the dinners where he had held her hand like she was the only person in the world, the moments when she had truly believed he cared for her. It sickened her to know that those memories were tainted. All those moments had been lies. With a deep breath, Juliet opened her car door and stepped out, feeling the cool night air hit her face. Each step toward the entrance felt heavier than the last, but she refused to stop. She was done second-guessing herself. Philip needed to hear the truth, and she needed to say it. Philip's building was eerily quiet. The lobby was dimly lit, the silence pressing down on her as she stepped inside. The elevator ride felt agonizingly slow, each floor crawling by while her heartbeat thundered in her chest. By the time she reached Philip's door, her anger had settled into something sharper, something colder. She knocked hard, 3 times, her knuckles stinging from the force. When the door finally opened, Philip stood there looking like he had just stepped out of a magazine ad. His shirt was crisp, his hair perfectly styled, and his expression was one of calculated calm. For a moment, Juliet felt her resolve waver. He always had that effect, an ability to disarm her with nothing more than a confident smile. "Juliet," he said smoothly, stepping back to let her in. "I didn't expect to see you tonight." "I'm sure you didn't," Juliet shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. She didn't move from the doorway. Philip's smile faltered slightly, and she saw a flicker of annoyance flash behind his eyes. "Look, if this is about what happened, I know about the woman," Juliet interrupted. Philip's expression froze, the calculated calm cracking just enough for her to see the flicker of panic beneath. "Don't lie to me," she warned. "Lucy showed me the video." For a moment, Philip said nothing. His gaze shifted slightly, as though calculating his next move. Then his face hardened, the smooth charm vanishing in an instant. "You don't understand," he said flatly. "It wasn't what it looked like." "Don't insult me," Juliet snapped. "I gave you a second chance, and you threw it away like it meant nothing." "You think you're so perfect," Philip sneered. "Like you've never made a mistake in your life." "I've made plenty of mistakes," Juliet countered. "And trusting you was one of them." Philip's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Juliet felt a flicker of unease. The anger in his expression was different, sharper, colder. He took a step closer, his voice low and bitter. "You think you're better than me," he muttered. "Don't forget, I know you. I know what makes you tick. I know your weaknesses." Juliet held her ground, refusing to flinch. "No, Philip," she said evenly. "You knew the person I was when I trusted you. But I'm not that person anymore." She turned on her heel, her breath catching in her throat as she walked away. Behind her, Philip's voice followed, low and bitter. "You'll regret this," he warned. Juliet didn't look back. She kept walking, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Each step felt like peeling away the last of her doubt, the last remnants of whatever hold Philip had once had over her. She didn't stop until she was back in her car, the door slammed shut behind her. For a moment, she just sat there, gripping the steering wheel with trembling hands. The confrontation had drained her more than she wanted to admit. She had expected anger from Philip, but the cold hostility in his voice unsettled her. He wasn't the man she had once loved. That man had been nothing but an illusion. The truth was far darker than she had realized. Juliet took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. Philip was out of her life now. For good. Whatever had once connected them was broken, and she wouldn't waste another second doubting her decision. Driving home felt like shedding an old skin. The tension in her muscles began to ease, and by the time Juliet unlocked her apartment door, she felt lighter, almost free. Lucy was waiting inside, curled up on the couch with a mug of tea. The warmth of her friend's presence made Juliet's shoulders relax. "How did it go?" Lucy asked cautiously, setting her mug down. Juliet let out a tired breath as she dropped her bag by the door. "It's over," she said simply. "I told him exactly what I needed to say." Lucy studied her face for a moment before nodding. "Good," she said firmly. "He didn't deserve a second chance." Juliet sat beside her, resting her head against the back of the couch. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. The anxiety that had followed her since Philip's return seemed to have lifted, leaving behind something clearer, something stronger. "You were right," Juliet admitted softly. "About him. I should have listened to you sooner." Lucy smiled faintly. "I just wanted you to see what I saw," she said. "And now you have." Juliet closed her eyes, her thoughts drifting. For so long, she had believed that Philip's presence in her life had been necessary, that without him, she would somehow be missing something. But now, with him finally gone, she realized the truth. He had been holding her back, feeding her doubts and insecurities. Without him, she felt stronger, clearer. As her thoughts began to quiet, her mind drifted to someone else, Jay. She hadn't heard from him since he left, but somehow his absence felt louder than Philip's presence ever had. Juliet wasn't sure what that meant, but one thing was certain: whatever came next, she was ready to face it. Juliet sat alone in her office, the faint hum of the city outside barely registering as she stared at her phone. The screen lay dark, yet her fingers hovered above it as though the simple motion of unlocking it might somehow provide her with answers. It had been weeks since she last heard from Jay Carter, and even longer since she had seen him in person. The silence between them was unsettling. Not because they had ever been particularly close. They weren't friends, not really, but because his absence felt louder than it should have. He had walked into her life like a sudden storm, turned Nexateca's worst crisis into a controlled victory, and then vanished as quickly as he had come. He hadn't asked for recognition or thanks. He hadn't lingered to enjoy the praise or bask in the success of what he had accomplished. He had simply finished his job and left. Juliet told herself she should admire that kind of self-discipline. After all, she valued focus and efficiency above all else. But instead, it frustrated her. His departure had felt unfinished, like a conversation cut short before the important part could begin. Juliet leaned back in her chair, drumming her fingers absently against her desk. Part of her wanted to reach out, to ask where he had gone, what he was doing now, but she hated the idea of looking weak. If Jay wanted to stay in touch, he would have reached out by now. And yet, the quiet emptiness in her office felt heavier lately, like a space that should have been filled but wasn't. In the weeks following Jay's departure, Juliet had buried herself in her work. It was how she had always coped, with structure, strategy, and long hours spent building something solid. Nexateca's investors had calmed, their concerns softened by her reassurances and a steady increase in stability reports. Employees seemed to be returning to their routines, and the shadow of the breach no longer loomed over the company like a storm cloud. On the surface, everything was back to normal, yet Juliet knew better. Something about the way she moved through her days felt different now. The satisfaction she once felt after a productive day seemed muted. Meetings felt hollow, and even the triumphs seemed smaller than before. More than once, she found herself pausing outside the server room, staring at the empty space where Jay had spent hours working to fix the damage. She remembered the way his fingers had moved confidently over the keyboard, the quiet focus in his expression as he had unraveled the mess that had nearly brought Nexatech to its knees. Juliet had trusted him, more than she was comfortable admitting, and she missed his presence more than she should. It wasn't logical, and Juliet hated that. Feelings like this didn't belong in her world of facts, figures, and strategy. Yet no matter how much she tried to dismiss it, thoughts of Jay refused to leave her alone. Juliet's frustration grew as the weeks stretched on. She knew Lucy had noticed. Her friend was sharp like that, always able to read the moods Juliet tried to hide. One evening, while they were both home, Lucy cornered her in the kitchen. "You've been in your head for weeks," Lucy said, setting her mug of tea down on the counter. "What's going on?" Juliet shook her head. "It's nothing," she replied too quickly. Lucy's eyebrows rose in a silent challenge. "Juliet, don't," she said. "You've been weird ever since that whole mess with Philip ended. Don't tell me you're still thinking about him." "It's not Philip," Juliet admitted. Lucy's expression softened slightly. "Then what is it?" Juliet hesitated. She didn't know how to put it into words, not without sounding ridiculous. "It's Jay," she said finally. "I haven't heard from him since he left." Lucy tilted her head thoughtfully. And, I don't know," Juliet said, her voice quieter now. "I guess I thought he'd at least keep in touch." Lucy smiled faintly. "You like him?" Juliet shot her a sharp look. "It's not like that." "Sure," Lucy said, sipping her tea. "You just keep thinking about a guy you don't like, for no reason." Juliet sighed, dropping into a chair. "He's just different," she said. "He doesn't play games. He doesn't say things just to impress people. He's real, and that's rare." Lucy nodded slowly. "So call him," she said simply. "Or are you just going to sit here and wait for him to magically appear?" "I can't just call him," Juliet muttered. "Why not?" Lucy asked. "You're the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, Juliet. You're smart enough to run Nexatech, but you're too scared to dial a phone." Juliet didn't answer. She knew Lucy was right, but the thought of reaching out felt too risky. What if Jay didn't want to hear from her? What if he had forgotten her altogether? She didn't know if she could handle that answer. Days turned into weeks, and Juliet continued to bury herself in work. Nexatech's reputation had stabilized, and her investors were regaining confidence, yet Juliet still felt unsettled. Nights became the hardest. After long hours spent in meetings or reviewing reports, she would return home to her apartment, pour herself a glass of wine, and sit in silence. The TV often played quietly in the background, but she never really paid attention to it. Her thoughts always drifted back to Jay. More than once, she had unlocked her phone, stared at his number, and then set it down again. Each time, she convinced herself it wasn't the right moment, that he was busy, that it wasn't her place to disturb him. But each time she put the phone away, the hollow feeling in her chest seemed to grow heavier. Then, one evening, as she sat at her desk finishing emails, her phone buzzed. Juliet barely glanced at it, expecting yet another business message. But when she saw Jay's name on the screen, her breath caught. For a moment, she didn't move. Her pulse quickened, her fingers hovering above the screen. The message was simple. "Hey. Just wanted to check in. Hope things are okay." Juliet stared at the words for what felt like an eternity. He hadn't forgotten her. He hadn't disappeared completely. With her heart pounding, she typed back, "I'm okay. Nexateca's stable now. Thanks to you. Her fingers hesitated before she added, "Where are you?" His reply came faster than she expected. "Back in Lagos. Just got in last week." Juliet's heart jumped. He was back. He was here. Before she could second-guess herself, she typed quickly, "We should catch up." Jay's response came just as fast. "I'd like that." Juliet set her phone down, her chest still tight, but this time the weight she had been carrying didn't feel quite so heavy. For the first time in weeks, something inside her felt right. Juliet sat at her office desk late in the evening, her phone resting within arm's reach. The message from Jay was still fresh in her mind, and she couldn't stop rereading it. It was simple, just a few words, but those few words had done something to her. For weeks, she had convinced herself that she wouldn't hear from him again, that he had moved on without a second thought. Now that she knew he was back in Lagos, her thoughts felt louder, harder to silence. She kept replaying memories of the brief time they had worked together. His quiet intensity, his calm focus when everything at Nexatec had seemed ready to collapse. She remembered the way he had handled the crisis without hesitation, solving problems faster than anyone else in the room. More than that, she remembered how he had looked at her, sharp, observant, yet never judgmental. Jay had made her feel like she didn't need to have all the answers, that she could lean on someone for once. Juliet hated that she missed him. It wasn't logical. They hadn't spent enough time together for her to justify this feeling. Yet she knew it wasn't just about what Jay had done for Nexatec. It was something deeper, something about the way he had made her feel like she wasn't alone. The next day, Juliet couldn't focus. Her morning meetings felt like background noise, the words of her clients and employees washing over her without sticking. She kept glancing at her phone, half expecting Jay to text her again. She knew she should be the one to reach out. They had already agreed to catch up, but something kept stopping her. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something more complicated. Jay wasn't like anyone else in her life. He didn't play by the same rules. Juliet had spent years building herself into the person she was. A disciplined leader, someone who refused to let emotions interfere with her decisions. She had structured her life around stability and control, carefully balancing her professional success with just enough distance from people to avoid unnecessary complications. But Jay had unsettled that balance without even trying. He had walked into her life like a force of nature, quietly confident yet impossible to ignore. And now that he was back, Juliet wasn't sure what she wanted from him, or what he wanted from her. As she stared down at her phone again, Lucy's voice startled her. "Still thinking about him?" Lucy's teasing smile softened the sharpness of her words. Juliet forced a small smile and set her phone aside. "I'm just wondering if I should text him," she admitted. Lucy laughed lightly. "You don't have to overthink this. Just text him." Juliet exhaled sharply. "It's not that simple." "It is," Lucy insisted. "Look, you like him. He clearly wants to see you. Don't turn this into something bigger than it is." Juliet wanted to argue, but she knew Lucy was right. She picked up her phone and typed quickly before she could second-guess herself. "Dinner tomorrow? I know a good spot." She hit send before she could change her mind. A minute later, Jay's reply appeared. "Sounds great. 7. Juliet felt her breath release in a slow exhale. For the first time in days, her thoughts felt a little less tangled. Juliet found herself lingering in front of her bedroom mirror longer than usual. She had tried on 3 different outfits before settling on something simple yet elegant, a fitted navy dress paired with modest heels. As she adjusted her earrings, she caught herself frowning at her reflection. Why was she so nervous? This wasn't a date. It was just dinner, just two people catching up after a shared crisis. Yet no matter how much she tried to convince herself of that, her pulse refused to slow. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Jay's eyes, the way they seemed to see right through her. Juliet wasn't used to that. Most people saw only what she wanted them to see, the composed CEO, the sharp negotiator who always seemed to have the answers. But Jay had seen her tired, frustrated, uncertain. And he hadn't judged her for it. As she grabbed her purse, Juliet reminded herself to stay calm. Whatever this dinner was supposed to be, she couldn't let herself get carried away. Jay was just a man. A smart, capable one, yes, but still just a man. She had faced far bigger challenges than this. Yet as she drove to the restaurant, her hands kept tightening on the steering wheel. When Juliet arrived, Jay was already waiting outside. He stood casually near the entrance, hands in his pockets, his gaze relaxed but alert. Dressed in a crisp black shirt and dark jeans, he looked sharp yet effortless. For a moment, Juliet hesitated, watching him from across the street. He seemed so comfortable, so unaffected, as if this meeting was just another part of his day. Meanwhile, her nerves were tangled so tightly she felt she could barely breathe. Taking a steadying breath, Juliet crossed the street. Jay smiled when he saw her, a genuine smile that softened the sharpness of his features. "Hey," he greeted. "Glad you made it." "Of course," Juliet replied, forcing her voice to sound casual. "I wouldn't miss it." As they stepped inside the restaurant, Juliet was surprised by how easy the conversation flowed. They talked about everything except Nexatech, their childhood memories, their favorite places to eat, even the strangest moments they'd encountered in their careers. Jay's sense of humor surprised her. Dry, sharp, yet never cruel. He had a way of finding humor in even the most frustrating situations, and Juliet found herself laughing more than she had in weeks. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she didn't have to guard herself, didn't have to measure her words or maintain her usual professional armor. With Jay, she could simply be herself. As dinner wound down, Juliet felt something unexpected, a reluctance to leave. She had assumed this dinner would feel like closure, a way to satisfy her curiosity and ease the weight of unanswered questions. But instead, it felt like the beginning of something else. As they walked out of the restaurant together, Jay slowed his steps slightly. "I'm glad we did this," he said quietly. "It's been nice." "Yeah," Juliet agreed. "It has." For a moment, they stood on the sidewalk in silence, neither of them quite sure what to say next. Juliet glanced at him, unsure how to end the evening. Part of her wanted to leave things simple, just a friendly goodbye, but another part of her knew she wasn't ready to walk away just yet. "I should probably get going," she said, her voice quieter now. Jay nodded, but his gaze lingered on her. "Yeah," he said, though he didn't move. For a moment, Juliet thought he might say something else, something important, but instead, he smiled faintly. "Take care, Juliet," he said. "You too," she replied. As she walked back to her car, Juliet couldn't shake the feeling that something unfinished lingered between them. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure if she wanted to let it go. Juliet walked out of the restaurant with Jay beside her, the night air cooler than she expected. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the pavement, and the faint hum of distant traffic seemed to create a quiet bubble around them. Their conversation had flowed so easily over dinner, but now, in the silence, Juliet felt an unfamiliar tension. Not an uncomfortable one. More like something that hovered between anticipation and hesitation. She tucked her hair behind her ear and glanced at Jay, who walked with his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed yet alert. There was something about the way he carried himself that always struck her, a quiet confidence that seemed effortless. It wasn't the forced charisma she had grown used to in her business circles, or the smooth charm Philip had once wielded so effectively. Jay's confidence felt real, grounded in something stronger than ego. "I'm glad we did this," he said, his voice calm yet certain. "Me too," Juliet answered quietly. She meant it. For weeks she had felt tangled in her own thoughts, unsure if reconnecting with Jay had been the right move. But after spending the evening with him, she realized how much she had needed this. Needed someone who wasn't part of her corporate world, who didn't see her as just Juliet Parker, the CEO. With Jay, she felt like herself again. The version of her that existed before Nexiteca's success had hardened her edges. They stopped at the corner where Juliet had parked her car. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jay shifted slightly, like he was debating whether to say something else. Juliet's heart began to race, and she hated that she felt so unsteady. She wasn't the type to get flustered. She had faced boardrooms filled with investors twice her age without breaking a sweat, but somehow standing there with Jay made her nervous in a way she couldn't explain. "So," Jay said finally, breaking the silence, "I guess this is good night." His smile was faint, almost hesitant. Juliet felt her pulse quicken. Part of her wanted to leave things there, to keep it simple. But there was another part of her that wasn't ready to say goodbye yet. "Yeah," she said softly. "I guess it is." She turned to unlock her car door, but before she could reach for the handle, Jay spoke again. "Juliet." She turned back to him, her breath catching slightly. "I'm glad you called," he said. "I wasn't sure if you would." "I wasn't sure either," Juliet admitted. "But I'm glad I did." He smiled again, and this time it wasn't hesitant. It was warm, confident. The kind of smile that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. For a second, Juliet thought he might say something else, something important, but instead, he just nodded. "Good night," he said quietly, stepping back from the curb. "Good night," Juliet echoed. She watched as he walked away, disappearing down the street, and felt an ache in her chest she hadn't expected. The drive home was quiet, but Juliet's thoughts were anything but calm. She kept replaying the evening in her mind. The laughter, the way Jay's eyes seemed to soften whenever he looked at her, the warmth she had felt just being around him. It terrified her how much she had enjoyed his company, how easily she had let her guard down with him. She had spent so long convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, that her independence was what made her strong. But tonight had reminded her of something else. That strength didn't have to mean solitude. As she pulled into her parking space, Juliet lingered in her car, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. For years, she had believed that her life needed to follow a clear path, one that revolved around her career, her goals, and nothing else. Love had felt like a risk she couldn't afford to take. After Philip's betrayal, she had told herself she was better off focusing on what she could control. Her company, her success, her carefully structured life. But Jay had disrupted that certainty without even trying. He hadn't asked her to be anything other than herself, and somehow, that had left her feeling more vulnerable than she was prepared for. Juliet closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. She couldn't afford to get carried away. Jay had his own life, his own priorities. Whatever connection they had tonight, it was probably nothing more than a fleeting moment, something that felt bigger than it actually was. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself of that, the feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. Days passed, and Juliet tried to focus on work, but the sense of unfinished business with Jay kept creeping back into her thoughts. She found herself checking her phone more often than usual, hoping for a message that never came. Each time she set it down, she told herself she was being ridiculous. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to say, more to understand about whatever this was between them. One evening, as she sat on her apartment balcony with a cup of tea, Juliet's phone finally buzzed. Her heart jumped, but when she saw Jay's name on the screen, her breath caught. The message was short. "I had a great time the other night. We should do it again." Juliet stared at the screen, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. She knew this was the moment to set boundaries, to play it safe and keep things casual. But as she thought about Jay's smile, about how calm she had felt around him, her fingers moved on their own. "I'd like that," she typed. "Soon." She set her phone down, her heart still racing. Whatever this was, Juliet knew one thing for certain: it wasn't over yet. Juliet never thought her life would take the turn it had. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions: grief, frustration, regret, and hope, but somehow, through it all, Jay had become her steady anchor. He had returned to Lagos quietly, without grand gestures or expectations, yet his presence had become a part of her world before she even realized it. What started as casual dinners and quiet conversations soon became something more, a connection Juliet hadn't expected, one that terrified and comforted her all at once. Jay had a way of understanding her without demanding too much. He never pushed her to open up, yet somehow she found herself doing so anyway. He knew when she needed to vent after a long day, and when silence was the best comfort. In his presence, Juliet felt less like the CEO constantly navigating corporate battles and more like herself, a woman who could laugh freely, who didn't have to hide her insecurities behind a professional mask. It was that quiet understanding that pulled her closer to him, and soon, seeing Jay became the one part of her day she looked forward to the most. One quiet evening, after months of healing, rebuilding trust, and discovering the depth of their bond, Jay surprised Juliet at home with a simple but heartfelt proposal. He led her out to the balcony where the city lights twinkled below, and with Lucy watching from inside with teary eyes and a proud smile, Jay dropped to one knee and asked Juliet to marry him. There was no hesitation. Juliet said yes, overwhelmed with love for the man who had not only helped her recover what was lost but also stood by her through her most vulnerable moments. Their wedding was intimate and beautiful, surrounded by close friends and family. But it was only the beginning. Together, Jay and Juliet became a power duo, blending Juliet's strategic brilliance with Jay's innovative mind. He became her most trusted partner, personally and professionally, as they expanded Nexatech into a global tech empire. Through the highs and lows, their love never wavered, and they built a life filled with trust, purpose, and happiness, side by side, always stronger together. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, share, subscribe to Triple C Stories. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section and stay tuned for more exciting stories.